and gentlemen, how are we doing? Gosh, there's a lot of you. I'm super, super excited to have you guys here today and see so many familiar and new faces. I'm really, really excited to also be back here in the UK because I've not been back for a while. So, you are here today for the State of Student Living, the UK and Ireland. We're going to cover lots of topics on the state of student living in terms of investment, operations, so the exciting activity. And then we're also going to be talking about well-being and community as well. We're also going to have a really awesome overview of what's happening in terms of trends and shifts in the sector. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what's been happening so far this year, because I know quite a few of you have been kind of coming along with us, you know, a bit of a road show that we've been having. So we started in Vienna. I'm also going to read my notes just in case I say something daft. So we delved into the discussion, looking at the changing trends in student mobility, suggesting how internationalization in Europe and education is rapidly increasing post-COVID. We then went to Amsterdam, and we spoke about how this internationalization is impacting policy reform and how we can collectively work together to create something, an environment with the municipalities, the councils, the private sector and public sector together and positively change those. Then we went to sunny Milan. Anybody that went to Milan? Anybody got a nice mosquito bite? I was absolutely eaten. So I apologise for the mosquitoes, but the event itself was very good. So there we focused on sustainability, ethical investment, future-proofing developments, and green operations. Our community argued that better public and private partnerships were the key to solving this. So finally, we're here in London, as I mentioned. We're going to jump straight into this crucial conversation around well-being and community. What are the students' needs? How we can support them holistically, and how we can reach those at-risk students. We then will discuss, as I said, the big picture, investment, future of the sector. So I'm super excited to welcome our speakers and partners and community here today. So, quick thank you. Our platinum sponsors, Glide, who have supported us literally from the very beginning. They've been at every single event and have really helped make this happen. We've also got our gold sponsors, Yugo, over in the corner, guys, who are an amazing operator all here, but also across Europe and in the US as well. I also just wanted to note, who attended the site tours this morning? Yeah, enjoyable. I know there was quite a few of you. I hope you enjoyed yourself there. We've also got Techno Gym over in the corner here. Give us a wave. So Techno Gym have got some really cool equipment over here. So if you fancy yourself as a bit of a fitness fanatic, I want to see some legs working. I live in Amsterdam, so I'm all game for a bike. We actually have a Techno Gym bike and bench providing live and on-demand content. They've also provided little gifts underneath your chair if you've not checked already. So make sure you thank them later as well. And then not to mention our wonderful hosts, Greystar, and our long-term partner. So I'm going to invite Johnny up to quickly give us a bit of information about who Greystar are and why this space. And yeah.
Kellyanne, thank you very much for that lovely introduction. Hopefully I'll be a bit shorter than that. For those who I haven't met, my name's Johnny, and I have the privilege, and it really is an absolute privilege, to serve, and I really do see it as serving our residents and our team members across our European business, about 7 countries. And I want to just welcome you all with a real warm Greystar welcome to Chapter Spitalfields. And you're in a space which I think in many respects represents what I think the class is about. It's something which we redesigned a couple of years ago. It's an opportunity for people to collaborate, come together, be open, be visible with our residents, and sort of help us deliver the service that we know they demand. And it was just so amazing earlier on today that we had an opportunity to host a session with not just CEOs and directors, but also property managers, or as we call them, community managers, those at the coalface, about their lessons learned from COVID. And it's something that I'm absolutely passionate about, is that with the lessons learned from COVID and what our team members did for our residents and for our businesses during COVID, we give those team members the opportunity to get out in the industry and learn, because they are the ones who are the future. And so I would love to be in a place in a couple of years' time where we come to an event like this, and with all due respect, it's not full of so many sort of senior people, but there are more junior people in the room. I think that would be really cool. So hopefully today's the start of that. But very quickly, just to finish off, in the room today we've got Julia. Julia, maybe give us a wave. So Julia is the community manager for Chapter Spitalfields. And when I told her that she would be hosting the week after check-in of a building that's got over 1,000 beds in it, this community event, I don't know how chuffed she was. But Julia, thank you for facing into it sort of with proactivity. Yeah. And positivity. I think Julia's checked in about 700 students over the last couple of days. So it is slightly busy. Julia, thank you for everything that you've done to make this possible, to organise it with Maria, and total star. Thank you very much indeed. And with that, I think I'll hand over to
Thank you, Johnny. Thank you
Martin.
so much. So I just want to just tell you a little bit about the swap card. So you should all have access to the swap card, especially you guys at home, considering that's how you're watching us. On there, we're going to be asking polls. You can also ask questions. You can network with each other, people in the room and at home. So please utilise that space. But for people in the room, if you would like to ask any questions, we'll have a bit of time at the end of each session. Raise your hand, stand up, we'll pass you a mic, and you'll be on the telly. So, okay, so we're going to kick off today by inviting Martin Blakey onto the stage, where we're going to host a discussion on looking back and looking ahead on the PBSA market. I said pause. Hi, are we too far away?
No, I don't think. It depends.
We're over COVID now,
Right,
aren't we?
okay, yeah.
Okay, so I don't know if you know Martin, but I have a bit of a history with Martin, not in a weird way. So I actually got into student accommodation because of Martin. He inspired me. I, as a student and a sabbatical officer in Leeds, actually sat on the Unipol board. Martin then decided to persuade me to come and work for Unipol. And it was a journey from there, really, wasn't it? So everything that I know about students and student accommodation is really from Martin. So I don't know if that says a lot about my views, but... So Martin, do you want to introduce yourself?
Okay, yes, right. Martin Blakey, Chief Executive of Unipol. It may be worth just saying a bit about Unipol. We're a housing provider, so we house students in Leeds, Nottingham and Bradford, about 3,000, soon to be 4,000. We have a close relationship with a whole number of universities, not even Trent. You'd expect us to have Nottingham and Leeds and Bradford. And we operate, as far as you're concerned, probably our profile is at least 2 of the 3 government recognised approved codes of standards. So private sector code, it's got just over 400,000 bed spaces in it, about another 50,000 in the educational code for us. So we're seen as a bit of the regulator. So I'll be having a show of hands for those people who've had late buildings this year. No, not really. And we do a bit of research and produce regular reports. So both Kellyanne and Jess, who's from Unipol down there, did the accommodation cost survey, which came out this time last year, which is regarded as a definitive survey. But I also wrote with Sarah Jones, who's not here today. I think David Feeney's here today. Where's David? Is he in the room? Oh, hello, David. The reason I've got this piece of paper is because of you. Because every time we'll say a figure, you'll say, well, it's not quite like that. So I've got them written down here. So I'm feeling a bit intimidated, really. like to just, it's a lovely area this day, just like to have a half-hour walk. So, and we did the student accommodation, the FACS, which is a Higher Education Policy Institute thing. We're doing some stuff on students with families going forward and on student maintenance, or the lack of it. And in general, we're student-focused, which Kellyanne's really introduced, and Jess actually followed on, I think, directly or indirectly from Kellyanne. I should just say, actually, because having had, you know, Kellyanne work for me, I'd forgotten about this kind of wave of enthusiasm that you get with Kellyanne. And when you used to work for me, I used to come out of meetings thinking, I'm feeling deliberately down and dour now, you know, I'm trying to counterbalance that, you know.
That wasn't my intention.
So I'm just beginning, I should just say, I'm just recalling that feeling, you know.
Can you do it after our conversation?
Yeah, I'll try and, I'll do that, I'll try and save that for David's session, yeah.
Fabulous. Okay, so we're going to look at the current landscape of the market in the UK and what the key trends are and what we're seeing. So I would like to discuss the evolving student experience and the footprint. So students are spending less time on campus and they're using the facilities more, and they're also spending a lot more time in their cities and communities. What do you think this means for developers and operators?
Okay, well, we saw during COVID, didn't we, a real fall off of face-to-face teaching, and at that moment, people's residential experience was their university experience. So, briefly, we got that kind of eclipse effect where one thing was in front of the other. I think it's interesting that despite all the stuff about refunds and students going home, if you looked at your own occupancy levels, so long as you weren't relying on international students, actually your occupancy levels would have been quite high. And in some cases, higher than it would have normally been at certain times of the year, like early in the new year and so on. I think we were at 80% occupancy on the 4th of January this time last year, as opposed to about a third. So I think we all learned that the kind of buildings that we've been developing have to cope with that kind of central resource. And if you look at the kind of building we're in today and what you visited earlier today, you've got these large communal areas which are kind of open spaces that students with organising can make their own. So they have really come into their own, and I would just share with you what I think is a much longer term effect. If you look at footfall on a lot of university campuses, and in fact most of them, you're not really exceeding more than about 50% of pre-COVID levels, and you weren't doing that in the final term this year. If you look at where those students are living, they're often living in communities that are quite a bit more vibrant than they were before. So in Leeds you've got Headingley, lots of little coffee shops all going on. So students are socialising, but they're not necessarily socialising on campus. And I think that throws up a bit of a challenge for universities. I mean, universities are having a real problem, whether they admit it or not, getting staff back to campus. And there are whole university departments that still have not returned to campus from March. And I don't think that's going to be sorted out soon. But I suspect there's a kind of 5-10 year change here. I don't think this is going to go away. So I think your buildings are going to be important as social centres. And if you're in institutions, you're almost competing. But it's not like that. Students, I mean, why would you go to a Formica top table and pay £2 for a coffee in the middle of campus when you can wander downstairs with your mates and have a free coffee and sit somewhere nicer? And the answer is, guess what? Guess what's happening? So I think there are huge implications in terms of where students are and where we're going to see them.
I'm not changing the subject. That tree looks lovely, but I can't see the timer. And if anyone knows me and Martin, I will talk. We will talk forever. So that would be great. Thank you.
1825. Very appropriate, actually. It's when the Spitalfields famine was. Anyway, there we are.
So you talk about kind of communities and social spaces. So I guess then the natural progression there is talk about kind of the mental health provision. Obviously, we know that there's a growth in cases and support needed amongst students. But there's a real lack of expansion in the services, and that's not only kind of our own staff, but also in the the services within the communities, within the charitable. So do you think this is a bottleneck for our sector and for students?
Well, it's a nice image, isn't it? I don't think it's a bottleneck. I think there's just a lack of services. I mean, I think mental health services are really in a very bad condition in a bad way. There are other people, I'm looking down here at Jenny, so I'm feeling similarly intimidated, about mental health. I think it's very problematic, and I think we're seeing quite a lot of school students who have established mental health support packages over a number of years, and then when they transition to university, all that falls away, and they have to start again. So I think that's a problem. So if I could press a button, I'd have a lot more liaison between schools and universities for those very vulnerable students who are transitioning, and I think that would be a good thing to do. I also think universities have got to do a lot more in this area, and I think they think they've got to do a lot more in this area, but it's taking them a while to get around to it. If you look at the Higher Education Policy Institute's kind of happiness index, you're looking at students being a third of the level of satisfaction, and some of those questions are kind of, is your life worthwhile? 13%. Wow.
Yeah, it's a shame.
It's interesting, actually. I got a LinkedIn the other day that said 2 people have noticed you. I thought, is that it? Kind of vaguely, that fitted into, is your life worthwhile, really?
Well, two's better than none, isn't it?
Well, yeah, it's a very Kellyanne way of looking at it. So I think we've got some practical issues like data sharing. So it's always interesting if you get a serious incident that everyone knew that student was in trouble, but no one talked to each other. And that is still a big problem. It is improving, but it's still a big problem. You've got Edward Peck. I can't remember his formal title. He was announced as the wellness czar, wasn't he? Student support champion, right? So he's turned from a czar into a champion. It's okay. It's a 1970s TV series for me, but I'm sure if you can knock a few heads together, it will be great. And the Data Commissioner's Office is fairly poor in this area. I'm one of those people who think we ought to have a bit of legislative change in that area to enable people to talk to each other easily. But I think, I could tell you we've got some figures on the National Code that even where people have got a formal underwrite agreement, that their data sharing is only really sorted out in about 35% of cases. Right now, that's not anywhere near the same as saying, "There's a nice building across the road. Why don't you go and live there?" But that has to be sorted out, and the communications are not working properly.
But there's some powerful, people in the room. We've got some universities, we've got some, CEOs. Like, these are decision makers as well. A lot of the people in here. So if it is something that we can talk about today, I know we're going to speak about well-being a little bit later on, but use this space now to kind of start these
and there were some really good
conversations.
examples of good practice, and Bournemouth University's just done a general, which I'm sure people will pick up on, general data sharing agreement for people. It doesn't have formal relationships within that way. Jenny's been doing a lot of work on this, so there's some really good practice, and yet there's some really bad practice as well, right? So sooner or later we're into, I think, the naming and shaming a bit, really. But I think this is just how it is, and I think people get very insular. And I also think that some universities haven't really got to grips with the fact that, they're no longer in control of their own accommodation, and in some cases not in control of it at all. But this is an area that's very important to resolve. In fact, if we were looking at the National Code's next big development, we need to have a much more precise idea of what's the university's responsibility and what's the provider's responsibility. If we were here 15 years ago and I'd have said, it's going to be your responsibility to do welcoming events and Res Life programs and, a variety, therapy pets and, a lot of people would have said, you must be joking, we're a landlord. What we do is we give out keys. We've moved, rightly, to be dealing with all that so that the residential experience is not just about, is it a nice room? It's, are you in a community? Are you avoiding loneliness? Are you not anxious? So we've moved from that. Yeah. But how far do we want to go? And the question I normally ask people for when people say, I've spotted a line I'm not going to cross, is, hands up all those who are going to employ a building counsellor. And you think, no. That's the university's responsibility. So there are lines, I think, that we'd agree on, and those just need to be made a bit clearer, and who's paying for it and who's doing what. We'll get there.
Yeah, so when we're talking about kind of mental health provision in general, for me, I guess that goes hand in hand with also costs and finances, because you do find, although I do know, there's everybody has mental health, whether that's good or bad. But there is predominantly, higher figures in students that come from lower income backgrounds. Do you think there's education that needs to be had around the actual real cost of going to university?
Well, it doesn't help, does it, that the student maintenance arrangements are really just made up. So I did some work with Sarah on why is the maintenance level set at the level it's set at. And we kind of thought, actually, our pet theory was that in 1968, someone did a lot of work and they thought of a level and then it's just kind of inflated year on year. And we were wrong, actually, because in 1968, someone just made it up, right? So, if anyone would like to be, actually the Minister of State for Higher Ed's still going, isn't it? So, get on your phone. You'd be much better as an unelected person, as an Undersecretary of State, because I've learned they get paid more. They get paid about 40% more than MPs. But no, you could say, look, I'd like to review the student maintenance system, and then you do what a small landlord does to set rents, which is suck air through teeth. 9,000, there you go. And you'd have beaten the government. So we do need to look at that. I think students are in a slightly fortunate position in respect of energy this year, because most of you in the room are bearing that cost. So you've set your rents a long while ago. You've signed a lot of contracts, and a lot of those costs are not being pushed through into the 22-23 academic year. But I think they are going to be pushed through, obviously, into the 23-4 academic year. We'll see what the government's announced for business energy when they publish their detailed document. It looks like a loan, it looks like a COVID recovery loan option to me, but there are no real details before we came in today. But the maintenance loan is paid between £3,500 and £12,500, and about the average is that people get about 60% of that amount. That is way behind the level of inflation, and it's not going to be good enough. Part-time work's improved a bit, but I think affordability is still on the agenda. I think the other reason it's on the agenda is because there's a lot more people living in PBSA as opposed to smaller off-street houses. And off-street houses are much cheaper, and people need to understand why that is. It's not just about, big corporate institutions being greedy. That's not what it's about. Certainly in our buildings, by the time you get to your flat door with your key or your fob, you've spent 35% of your rent, right? You've walked through gardens, you've gone past security, you've gone into a nice area like this, you've gone up in a very expensive lift. All of this is heated, all of it's patrolled, all of it carries a lot of health and safety stuff. Whereas if you go to Hyde Park in Leeds or whatever, you're still on the street when you open your front door, and that's why it's more expensive. So as that accommodation goes down, now this is supposed to be about Ireland, isn't it? So a bit as well. So if we look at what's happened in Dublin, what we've seen is lots and lots of, actually quite upmarket student developments. Yeah, very luxurious. And we've seen a decline in off-street housing. Mm-hmm. And then you look at the average cost of accommodation in Dublin, and it's gone from something like €3,500 a year to something like €9,000 a year in about 4 or 5 years. Well, that will happen unless, and that's part, they had a 5-year strategy, didn't they? 7,000 rooms, I think they wanted in their strategy 5 years ago. But they didn't address affordability. So I think we have got to try and do that. But let's not fool ourselves, big buildings are expensive, and they're getting more expensive. And, it's difficult to keep those rents down.
Well, moving a little bit away from that, though, we had a conversation around kind of the types of study trends. We spoke a little bit about there has been a higher take-up in postgraduate courses at universities, which means a kind of major shift in how students and how long students are actually on campus or in the accommodation. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because some institutions are going to have to reinvent themselves. So let's just take an example. If I look out of my office window, if you look at Leeds Beckett University, down the bottom of the listings, faltering, where you went, faltering, yeah, partly responsible, faltering home student recruitment, but suddenly a huge increase in postgraduate taught students from India, Pakistan, Nigeria, right? Really huge, and we're talking here about them tripling the amount of international students in the space of a year. That's happening throughout the sector. So the post-92 ex-polys are taking lots and lots of students from India and Nigeria in particular, and for PGT, right? That's a new thing for them, and their numbers are increasing. Interestingly, the Russell Group universities are not getting a slice of that cake because people are competing on price. So studying as postgraduate at Leeds Beckett, half the cost of studying at the more than half the cost, right? So if you took a typical university, a post-92 institution, 5 years ago, they're probably geared to something like, unless, I mean, you can never really generalise and there'll be individual, but about 30% of their students being home-based, and the other 70% being mainly undergraduates living away from home. If we look at it today, it's probably 50% of their base is undergraduates living away from home. They probably had a small increase in commuter students, and then they've got annual postgraduates. Everything shuts out of term. It's a term-based system. So those institutions have really got to start reinventing themselves, and otherwise we're going to get a reputation for not giving great services to postgrads, and that'll, at the moment our reputation is very high internationally. So I think there's a lot going on there in terms of how the institution is perceived. I mean, certainly I went to a university 10 days ago, and there were loads of international students knocking around, and there was just nothing open. All the coffee bars are shut. There's no, it's feeling that you shouldn't be there. It's kind of, it had that kind of airport at 4 a.m. feel, and it shouldn't be like that. Yeah. What's more, actually, is they had several social areas, and they were all open. So there's kind of 20 students in each one. Whereas actually, if you had a central space, those people would come with proper servicing. They would come across each other much easier.
So it kind of sounds a little bit about like we've ended up being a little bit like a seaside.
Yeah, I think so.
Town.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Good parallel. Yeah.
So we've spoken about, obviously, I guess tenancies extending. Well, what about we look at tenancies that are now shortened? What are the shifts around kind of tenancy lengths in general?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I actually think that PBSA, what I actually think is that PBSA are very good at looking tough and then being quite considerate. So I suppose if I could say one thing, it's try and look considerate and be a bit more upfront about that. If you looked in Scotland during COVID, just as an example, you will know that a student could say, I'm going home because of COVID and I want out of my contract. And if you looked at the number of students who took up that option in Scotland, it was 6%. And of course, here in England, we didn't have that because, of the evil capitalist government. But if you looked at the number of students that were released from contracts in England, it was about 6%. And I would say to you, it was probably more sensitively operated because some of those people wouldn't have qualified under a regulatory system. Because you could have said, well, I know your dad's died, but that's not about you, is it? That's not you with COVID, is it? So you can't be dealt with. I think people are getting less nervous about filling spaces mid-year. I think the letting cycle is getting easier. And I think, in general, that people are fairly sensitive to dealing with special cases. And I think people should just put that up front. I'll tell you what, you're a hell of a lot more sensitive than a small landlord with a group of 5 people. I should just say on the way here, the cab driver said, oh, my daughter was studying at Kent in COVID, and we asked the landlord for a refund, and they were a complete bastard, right? So I guess that meant they didn't get one. They didn't, and I said, well, if she'd lived in a big building, you'd have probably had a more sympathetic hearing. And she said, yeah, well, I know someone my daughter's friend was in a big building and they got offered a reduction. But she didn't take it because she wanted to stay there, right? So, there it is in a nutshell. So I think the PBSA sector has lots and lots of rules, guarantors. I've never totally sold on them. We don't have them. It's never made any difference to our rent collection. Paying the rent a year up front, when actually a lot of international students reach individual arrangements. So I think it could all look more friendly. And I think people could just ease off a bit. And actually, I think operationally, we've got some very skilled managers in the room who are actually at the coalface here. They deal with this really well. actually. Otherwise, we'd know about it. And we get a couple of hundred complaints a year through the code. If you got this wrong, you know, we'd be getting thousands, right? So most of these issues are headed off with careful consideration, and, you know, deals are done.
That's a nice compliment to everyone in the room, isn't it? I'm going to ask the last question because we've only got a couple of minutes left. And it's a big question. So I also would like people at home and people in the room, if you would like to also answer this question on the swap card, if you would like. As a community, what do we need to do? What do we need to collectively work on? What do you think is something we should take away and work on?
Well, okay, I think it's interesting because I think you go back to a stereotype of the sector, and I wouldn't want people to think that's gone away, right? So it is still the case, if you talk to policymakers and politicians, that they really do think that people live in a university hall in the first year and then they go in a little house. And if you could do one thing, it's just to disabuse them of that, and also disabuse them of when I was a student, because that was a long while ago. So it'd be helpful to try and get across clearly what the sector is. The PBSA sector is housing a large number of returning students. It is not linked, in many cases, to an educational institution. We've seen direct lets increase to over 250,000 students, 114% increase in 3 years, right? So that's the world we live in, and that's the world we're going to be increasingly in as the smaller houses disappear. They'll disappear over a longer time if a Renters Reform Act is changed. Otherwise, it'll happen very quickly. It's happened in Glasgow very quickly this year. So, you know, I would just say it will be useful to try and make it. Don't assume that people know what the sector is. And I just wanted to share with you my big thought for today, because, you know, it didn't fit into any of your questions.
All right, sorry about that.
And
yeah.
I've got 36 seconds to say it.
Yeah.
But I think what's interesting is you're seeing lots of little accommodation crises break out all over the place at the moment. And what that means is that universities who have disengaged a bit from the supply side of accommodation, and they've just assumed that all your buildings are empty, you know, for first-year students, right? And, you know, what they've done is said, well, I need 100 rooms, so I'll just pick the phone up and I'll talk to IQ or whatever and say, I'd like 100 rooms, please. And IQ will go, oh, thank you so much, you know, we're so grateful. And they're all full. And the reason they're full is because they're all full of returning students. And so institutions need to get to grips with the fact that if you disengage from the supply of student accommodation, your first-year students are going to be last in the queue because everybody else is going to get in before you. And that's exactly what's happened this year. And, you know, in Glasgow, they have scrapped their accommodation guarantee. They haven't made it smaller. It's gone. We cannot house people. There is nothing for first-year students. This is a partnership. You know, whether it's a commercial partnership or not is irrelevant. But, you know, don't push the risk onto the private sector and then expect them to just sit there hoping for your munificence. That is not how it's going to work.
Yeah, so you're also stating there, though, as well, that universities also need to be more transparent when they're inviting more students to the cities.
Well, I think you know, I think the Advertising Standards Authority should take an interest in this, and they probably will at some stage. I mean, if I see an advert that says, come and have a wonderful time at the University of Manchester, you know, I'm not planning to be in Liverpool. Although there are people in the room who'd argue that's an upgrade. So I always think Liverpool's just so great, isn't it? It's that old joke about...
Not now,
I'm going to do it. 3 people asked, what's the second city of Britain? And someone from Birmingham says Birmingham, someone says Leeds, Manchester, and then you ask the guy from Liverpool, and he says, well, London. And that's so true. But no, I mean, you know, so I think, you know, if you wanted to go to York University, would you really be happy living in Hull? That, you know, by the way, if Unite or IQ or Greystar or whatever said, oh, well, I know we've rented you a room in London, but actually we're going to put you in Canterbury, you know, you wouldn't get away with that. And institutions shouldn't either. It's just misleading.
Okay, so that's everything from me and Martin. Thank you so much for listening to us. We are now going to move on. So, yeah, thank you. It's only because we went over. I'm sorry, Martin. Thank you. So do you want me to just...
Go for it.
So up next we have a panel on the well-being and community talk. We have some amazing people up on stage. Scott is moderating, so I'm going to invite him up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin and Kellyanne. If our panel want to come forward as well and take a seat, that'd be great. Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. And thank you to the Class Foundation, my colleagues, for asking me to moderate this session. We've got a discussion today on how we sort of build communities and look after students in terms of well-being, which, following on from the introduction there, I think is something we could explore kind of all day. The discussion this morning with the Greystar team and colleagues was really interesting. And touched on some of these issues. So to do this in half an hour, I'm not sure we can completely do it justice, but there's some amazing good practice across the sector, and it's a great panel and a great cross section that we've got today to share both ideas and thoughts on this sector, but also to share some good practice. And when I first talked to Kellyanne about this space and how this session could look, there's that kind of constant question of, we're all doing some great things, but terrible things still happen in student accommodation, and how can we tackle those, and how can we give people the skills? So I'm going to just ask for context, particularly the mixture of people in the room and people at home, for our panel, just to introduce themselves and where they're from and the sort of context they have, whether it's UK or European, because I think that helps to set the scene. And then we'll move straight into the panel and start asking some questions. So Rebecca first, thanks.
Thank you. Hi everyone, my name is Rebecca O'Hare and I'm the Assistant Director of Residence Life and the Accommodation Office at the University of Leeds, where we have 8,500 students in residence. Our Residence Life team is comprised of about 100 staff members, so residential wardens, resident life assistants who are student roles, and full-time staff members as well.
Jenny?
Hi, my name's Jenny Shaw. I work for Unite Students. I'm the Higher Education External Engagement Director. And we have accommodation right across England, Scotland and Wales.
And Darren.
Hey everyone, Darren Gardner from Nido Students. I look after the business as a whole. We've got roughly 8,000 beds across 6 countries now, and growing into Europe quite rapidly.
Brilliant, thank you, and welcome everybody. And I know it's an extremely busy time of year, so it's great to put this panel together and have so many colleagues in the room and online following us. As I said, my name's Scott, and I'm really excited not only to chair this panel, but to be able to share with you a big development that we've had at the Class Foundation recently, and we'll be launching the European Student Wellbeing and Living Monitor, which is going to be our survey that we've been working on for quite some. I've gone off. There we go. For quite some time to develop the brand and the concept and build that partnership. So we're really excited to be able to start talking about that today. The logo's there on the screen, and to be able to bring that to you. And we'll be talking to colleagues and partners a lot more about that. The aim of the research is going to be to really understand the tangible benefits that spaces like this, like the space upstairs, the facilities we saw at UGO this morning, and the real impact that they're making on student well-being, and ultimately in terms of student academic achievement as well. So that's sort of partly why I'm here, but also to moderate this session. And just to set the scene very quickly, because I think in the UK in particular we're quite well versed, and there's a huge mixture. I've been sort of privileged to see a few of the class events this year, and the types of facilities, the national code, the focus on well-being that we have, that many people in this room will be familiar with, and even things like mental health training and first aid training for our managers. So there's a heck of a lot being done in this space, and I think it's great that we can continue to talk about that. But if we set the scene for the new intake, we sort of briefly just mentioned there some locations where there are shortages of accommodation. This group of students who are kind of the lockdown students who probably haven't done exams in many cases, or in some cases did exams that were far tougher than they expected, that they hadn't had chance to properly practice for. The cohort who've done lots of blended learning, And factor into that, in addition, certain worries, whether it's the students themselves or their parents in terms of cost of living, that the challenges are huge that are facing the students that are coming to live with us this year. So how we step up as a community and as accommodation providers, and it was quite a nice touch, I think that Martin mentioned that years ago it just wasn't the role of us, and I don't think anyone in this room would think that to be the case anymore. So I think that is the scene, and how we step up and how we do more and continue to do more, and how the outlook looks for us. The statistic touched on earlier, that 1 in 4 students felt lonely most or all of the time. So not just, I feel a bit lonely, but most or all of the time, as opposed to 1 in 20 people in the general population. And the pilot survey of the Student Wellbeing Monitor showed that many students were actually psychologically unhealthy. We did see evidence that intervention from providers and from their accommodation setting brought that to a healthier level, but it just shows the challenges in the last few years that students have faced. So first I want to ask our panel to share with us their insights. As I mentioned, this is around sharing good practice and then talking about some of the emerging themes. So Darren, I'm going to ask you to speak first, but could you share with us what you're doing with wellbeing at Nido and how your approach has been working?
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much, Scott. I think obviously initially, our approach is to treat our customers as young adults. Rather, we're not their parents. We're not there just to give them a list of rules and tell them what they can and they can't do. But there's a fine balance between that and ensuring they have the best start to their adulthood. But we're not full of rules and regulations. We like to keep them safe. We like to make sure everything's in place so they have a great environment in which to live. But we also understand that it's the first time that many of them are away from home, and with that comes the associated, stresses. What we have done for very many years is our best, and I think the industry should be applauded for that. We've all tried to do the right thing, signpost, make sure we have the resources, make sure we train the teams, and ensure we do the best for the students that face the challenges that they face. And I think going through COVID, and I know we're all trying not to talk about it, it's probably the only person wearing a mask on the train and the tube today, which was a bit weird, but that's fine. But I think people went through an incredibly stressful time, and whether that's been faced with a situation where they couldn't get home, faced with a situation where they couldn't go to do the education they wanted to, and they weren't necessarily provided with the tools in which to cope for that, and the ultimate pressure of what was happening in the global pandemic. What that really alerted all of us to is a knee-jerk reaction to do something, and I think that was the key. First step was doing something, not sitting around having panels, writing theses on what we should do during the pandemic. And as a community, we did a fantastic job. Across the board, I think we all stepped up. We did the right thing for the students. We fought investors for refunds. We made sure they were safe. We put in practice all the procedures that needed to take place, and we stepped up. More importantly, I didn't go out and start looking after the students, but my team did. Every single day, they were part of this challenge, and they were there looking after the students, keeping them safe, and trying to stick to the regulations. And that is a credit to our industry, and that is what it's all about, is empowering them to deal with those situations. So what did we learn from that? I think we learned very many things. But one of the key things from our point of view, and the approach that we're taking and we have taken for the last year, is really understanding about well-being. It has many different facets, whether that be mental, wealth, or health. Everyone is affected in different ways. And rather than just doing our best and kind of going with the same things that we've always done, we decided to employ a professional that you'd be glad to know we pay for. And we wouldn't ask the university to do it because it would take a lot of time. So we decided that it was a good investment of our and our responsibility to look after the people within the building. So we partnered with a clinical psychologist, very great name, Dr. Tara Quinn Cirillo. She's a fantastic psychologist, been in clinical psychology for very many years. And the nuance there was about us trying to understand why. So why does the brain work like the brain works? A lot of us think we know, but actually, there's very good scientific-based practices as to why people feel stressed, why they feel scared, why they feel anxious, why they feel nervous, why they won't talk to people. So we kind of put that approach at the heart of what we do now. And by understanding what happens in the brain and what happens when you're faced with different stresses, it's enabled us to understand how we can help and what we can do to help those students who are struggling. Because, until, nothing really bad happens in any of our residences, our job's not done. And unfortunately, during the last few years, we've all had to deal with unthinkable situations and deal with the outcome of that. And it is our responsibility and my responsibility to ensure we put that in place. So we've learned from our customers, we've asked them what they wanted, and we've tried to deliver a program that helps them. And I think that's important. Rather than us thinking what they need, ask them first, and then build a program around it. So we're very much focused on that. Well-being or mental well-being is become normalized from the common room to the boardroom. And I think it's about time we all focus and talk about that. Continually survey our customers and make sure we change and adapt, but more importantly, listen to the guys on the front line. And then put those packages together in a place that they can reach, which we'll talk about next, and enable, good things to happen, and be flexible. So that is our approach to the challenge ahead.
Thanks, Darren. Yeah, I think it's great to properly understand that and the idea of upskilling our students and preparing them, giving them tools that they can use in their future life. Jenny from Unite, please.
Yeah, thank you. So Scott, you gave a really good backdrop to this cohort and its needs. We've, in our recent applicant survey, across the whole of the sector, 20%, a fifth of applicants were coming into university with a mental health condition, and levels of anxiety were the highest I've ever seen in 10 years of surveying students. So I think that probably gives a bit of a background to why we're doing what we're doing. So we've just famously had an operational restructure. I think everybody in the country knows about that, which has been painful. But what it has done is it's given us much greater concentration and accountability around student experience at the property level. It's given us much better coverage at night time, including manager level coverage, which, as we know, is when a lot of things happen. So that's been really helpful. What we're doing this year is, because this is now a fully mainstream issue, we're looking at how we improve the mainstream. So we're upgrading our student support framework. We have increased the size and seniority of our student support team. We have our new framework for student support is designed to work more closely and more in harmony with processes within universities, so that there is a clear sort of handover there. We're improving training, so from basic training about dealing with incidents, how to escalate, right through to sort of specialist modules about things that we see. And we are also, alongside that, if that wasn't enough, we are introducing a new employee support framework as well, because the impact, as you will all know, the impact of difficult, distressing student incidents on frontline teams is devastating. And if we can keep our employees well and healthy and happy, they're in a better place to respond to the needs of students.
Thanks, Jenny. And I think the 9-to-5 model in certainly in the UK, and I think the places I've seen in Europe as well, is we've outlived that, but to change that is obviously a difficult process. And I think it was great this morning that the managers that we were talking to were all talking about being able to do everything and being there to do everything, and if somebody needs help, to help them. And that attitude, I think, runs through our sector and should be encouraged. So I hope that works well for you. And Rebecca, from the university perspective.
So from a University of Leeds perspective, what I say to people when they ask me what it's like to work at the University of Leeds, I say it's a beast. And I mean that in quite a positive way, because it's such a large institution, which I'm very privileged to be able to work at. But when you're making changes to support student mental health and well-being, sometimes projects can happen in a very siloed nature. So accommodation might be doing something, but student services could be doing something else, and then the academics could be thinking about a different piece of work. So sometimes I always think it's easier for PBSA operators to to roll out a strategy, because they can think about it in their head offices and then kind of deploy their resources and strategy as necessary. And sometimes it can be deployed in a much better way in comparison to universities. But at the University of Leeds, we've been talking an awful lot about sense of belonging and what that means and what it belongs to a university and what that looks like for a student and what it feels like in accommodation. And I've been thinking that quite a lot over the last couple of years since I've joined the university. But I think it's really important for us to understand what are the factors that affect sense of belonging in accommodation, not just to have students turn up and have all your events and activities there happening, which they may or may not attend. So our team have been learning about the socioeconomic factors, understanding the data and demographic data for our students who are coming to live with us, and how that might impact whether they feel a sense of belonging or not. If they're first in family, if they have encouragement or support from family members to go to university in the first place, those things are really, really important. And then operationally on the ground, our Residence Life team, I mentioned earlier on, is about 100 staff members, but it's recently expanded. It wasn't always that big. So our full-time staff members, it was only 2 full-time staff members for 8,500 students, which is extremely small. In the last year, that's increased to 5 staff members. Again, in my opinion, not enough, but it's going in the right direction. We've also introduced Residence Life social committees. We'll have one in every halls of residence. So if a student wants to run events or activities and put their hand up, they can absolutely do that. They don't have to be elected into it like what happens in some universities around the UK. And a great piece of work that we're doing is actually raising awareness about the residence life, both internally and externally. When I look at the student survey data that we have, unfortunately, while there is awareness there, it's nowhere near where we want it to be. So actually we're doing a lot of branding work at the moment and talking about residence life in a very public way, because if you look at our programme, it's probably a little bit siloed if we're honest. So we're trying to join that up a bit better and make sure students know what it's for and when they can go talk to a warden and why they would talk to a warden and what they can talk to them about so they can get the effective signposting service that they need. Centrally in the university, they've been increasing their counselling provision as well. We're quite a wealthy university that we're able to do that, but I know not all other universities are able to do that, so we're quite lucky that we can do that. But then training our staff on the ground, mental health first aid, mental health awareness, but also understanding the intersectionality of how that affects other students. So if you're from the LGBTQ plus community, what does it look like for you if you have mental health difficulties and how you might differ from somebody else who's perhaps identifying as cisgendered. So quite a lot that we're doing. I do feel that sometimes working in higher education is quite different because they want us to be all things to all people sometimes if you read the media every day, but a lot done and certainly a lot more to do over the next couple of years.
Thank you, and it's great to hear I think when we spoke about this session, the tenacity it takes to get the Res Life team, not just up and running, but part of the institution, and it costs money. It's a challenge to make that happen, but many universities are doing that, and I think yours is a great example, and there are other good cases out there. I think we've briefly touched there, and I think it's important to go further. So that's the kind of overview of what happens, but there's the challenge of the hard to reach student, and by that I don't just mean the quiet students who are happy being in their room all the time, but you talk there about minority students who are disproportionately affected by loneliness and well-being issues, and how are all the great things that we're doing, how are we ensuring that they get through for our students? So I want to explore that a bit further with you first, Jenny, please.
Yeah, I think there's a lot I could say on this topic, but I will restrict myself to one group of students, and that's black students. So we commissioned research last year. It covered the whole of the sector, the student accommodation sector, so university, accommodation and PBSA, and it was about the experience of black students in accommodation, and it made for quite shocking reading. We published it in February this year. Black students were on average having a poorer experience, and particularly as we're talking about community and sense of belonging, we're less likely to feel that sense of belonging community. We're less likely to feel welcomed and that it was a conducive environment. We found quite a lot of evidence of exclusion and racism, which students didn't feel confident to report because they didn't think that the staff were going to do anything about it, and a huge toll on the mental health. So it was a bit of a shocker. But we did as well, from that piece of work, get some really good recommendations, which we're busy implementing ourselves and encouraging others to do. And it's quite simple things like, when new students come in, make it clear what is expected in terms of respectful behaviour. So in another recent survey we did, most students wanted to make friends from different backgrounds, but only about 2/3 of them felt confident in being able to talk to people from different backgrounds. So there's a kind of an education gap there that can be bridged. Have a really good, clear process for dealing with complaints, particularly about racism and unrespectful behaviour, and make sure students know how to raise those with staff and make sure staff know what to do about that. Diversify your staff, or look at the diversity of your staff base, particularly at management level, because it's not a very diverse sector at management level. And finally, we do this for Chinese students. Why don't we do it for other minority ethnic groups? Just give information about cultural services in the area, where you get your head and where you get the foods you like to eat and so on. It helps students feel at home. And if this sounds like quite a niche issue, I've just come from the Universities UK annual conference with all the vice-chancellors, and they have been talking about the gap in the highest levels of degrees being awarded to black students and white students. There's a gap where universities are failing their black students, and they cannot get a purchase on this, they cannot get traction on this, and some of that solution must surely be within student accommodation, so we can really help universities and help students by doing this.
I think that's a really powerful message, and the research is amazing. To shine a light in the way it has, and to hear how quickly you've been taking steps from it is really good to hear. Rebecca, can we come to you next?
Just referencing that Live in Black at University research, because it's a really fantastic piece of research, and definitely a piece of research that was overdue for quite some time. We've been taking some of those recommendations, and if you haven't looked at it, I definitely suggest that you do, because I think they'd be very much applicable to regardless of what country that you're from, and looking at how we can implement those. So one of the things is looking at our application process and how we gather data to understand how we're allocating students. So, you know, we're in a danger sometimes, and I will say that Leeds is predominantly very much a white university, but there are black students there and students from other minorities. But sometimes we can be in the danger as someone who's in charge of allocations at looking at names and thinking those students will like to live together, when actually that's really not the case whatsoever. And you're almost creating a ghetto almost for some groups of students, and thinking that that's the right thing to do. My own area of passion is the training of staff members. I really think that we have a missed opportunity to showcase the world how this can be such a great profession. It's not professionalised in the same way as the UK, so we've been looking at understanding what are the minimum standards or levels of knowledge staff members should have when they work in our accommodation, regardless of what their role is, and creating pathways for them to progress. So understanding not just about how to manage a building and to sell a room and collect rental fees, but actually understand more about students themselves and about why they come to university and what the landscape is. So the information that you all gather today, do you share that back down to your site teams? That is an area of work that I like to do, so that they are equally informed about what's happening in the sector and how it's changing. So they really understand that if a student is having a difficult time and the challenges they're facing, how it affects them in their properties and how it affects the university experience. So it's a bit like what Martin said earlier on about, is someone noticing you, and are we equipping our staff in such a way that students can be noticed sooner rather than later?
Right, and then Darren, you were with us this morning, so it's just following that point around how do we get the message to people, or be there when people need us, and particularly those hard to reach students.
Yeah, and I think agreeing with my peers, we've got a duty of care to ensure that we're an inclusive community, and we do everything we can in order to promote that. And I think you have to be a little bit prescriptive sometimes to ensure that the teams on the ground are catering for all the needs of the people that they're seeing, and I very much believe in building a team that is based around the ethnicity of the customers that you attract, and I think that is a huge opportunity for all of us to work on, and amongst that then putting programs together that support those communities, and we celebrate them, and we do the things that they find important, and by doing that you get other people to cross, and they will go and they will take part in different events and they will learn, and I think that is part of growing up, and that's part of us all becoming a society that is inclusive. So we encourage that, we put programs together, but we make sure that the GMs are accountable on the ground to put those programs together. We then support them. Talking about the hard to reach students, which is quite difficult. First of all, it's understanding how our cohort now wants to communicate. And I keep going on about this because I think too many people think they know how the young people work these days. Respectfully, we don't. And respectfully, we all need to put a bit more research into that, because I don't know if any of you noticed, but the last time your kid picked up the phone and had a conversation on it, actually speaking. Generally, they all have blistered thumbs because all they do is DM. So when trying to communicate or reach students, trying to talk to them is quite challenging. So, you need to put in place, or we put in place, we try and meet our students where they want to be. And that is effectively in the world of social media, the world of direct messaging, and the world of kind of sharing snippets of information in bite-sized chunks to drag them in, get them to kind of participate. So in order to do that, once we understood them, yes, I know a lot of us have apps or platforms where we can communicate with people. But once you put effectively the phone, let's call it that, is the center to everyone's life, as long as you've got the broadband up and running, because that's the number one. Once they're in that world, you need to communicate that way. That doesn't mean face-to-face communication is gone. In fact, more importantly, having the channel where they can DM you and then come and physically speak to you increases the amount of conversations you have with people who are finding it difficult. And what we found by putting that in place and having the app up and running, whether it's fixing your tap, or I've got a problem, or I want to speak to you, or putting the resources that we have from Dr. Tara online with infographics, just short snippets, letting people participate but not actually engage, and that's a new thing. How many kids are just sitting there watching people play video games? I mean, go figure. But that's what people like to do. They like to just participate from the sidelines. So we encourage that when we are, holding our online forums, and indeed our face-to-face forums. We don't ask people questions if we can quite happily see them just participating by listening. And that's important because everyone will reach out in a different way. And once they understand that, what we have found is a lot more people are coming forward. They're then talking to the team. And the last thing I'd note is every single person in the residence is important. From the maintenance technicians, if that's what you call them, to the housekeepers, to the administrators, to the GMs, they need to be able to have a conversation with a student who is struggling. It can't be left up to the management team. And we put as much support into ensuring the maintenance techs and the cleaning team, can signpost and at least see if someone is struggling, and then at least point them in the direction of helping them. And if you can get all those touch points covered, what you'll slowly find is the hard-to-reach students come out of their shell, they start to participate, whether it be socially or just online, that's absolutely fine. And ultimately, we start to encourage people to talk about their challenges. And again, respectfully, that is our job.
Thanks. I'm just going to pause us there and see if we have any questions, either on the swap card or from in the room.
If there's anybody that would like to raise their hand, any questions? Anyone? Okay.
Hi everyone, I'm Jonas from Coley Technologies. Thanks a lot for insightful and very practical experiences from the past period. It's really nice to hear about those initiatives. Being a techie guy with a little bit of a connection from Darren, your final part, I'm curious on how, we're in the era of digitalization. What kind of possible use of technology do you see in the aspect of well-being and community? How would you be able to sort of curate your community and enable well-being in your environment?
So I think it's safe to say that each provider is making use of technology. And I think that's embedded in the answers that they gave in terms of how they're getting through. I think if we jump to each panelist for a very short answer before we get kicked off stage, we can then answer that from 3 different perspectives. So do you want to go first?
I'd say a week doesn't go by where I have somebody contacted me on LinkedIn or email me to say if I would be interested in their new mental health app or something to that effect, because there are so many getting created at the moment, and I can see a lot of nodding heads in the room, so I'm not the only one getting those emails, which is brilliant, because obviously we were just talking there about meeting students where they're at, but equally I am always thinking about, well, do we really want them to be living on their phones? Do we want them to be out there and engaging with people? Because you feel a connection with someone. I think cognitively you get a better kickback from meeting with people and being part of something. So I'm not necessarily against technology. I think then from a university perspective, we have a lot of work to do around having systems connect to each other, because actually in the University of Leeds, I also call it a university of systems, where a lot of our systems don't talk to each other. So things can happen in accommodation, and that's logged on an accommodation allocation system, but it doesn't update the people that need to know about it in student counselling. Those systems don't talk to each other, and I find it very infuriating. And I think a lot of things are happening in the sector in the UK around universities getting better at that, and data sharing amongst the most appropriate departments that need to know about it.
Jenny?
Yeah, it's relatively low-tech, simple things for us. So, for example, presenting resources, people to go to, signposting information on our app for each city, each university, surveying students about their demographics and their interests, so that can inform the community that's developed in the accommodation through our student ambassadors. So it's using quite simple technology. It's just thinking about what students need.
And Darren, just for the final thought for us.
Yeah, so I mean, I think realistically our centres around, the phone and how that works, and then pulling everything together, whether it be your parcel deliveries, whether it be your maintenance, whether it be your our online calendar, our physical calendar, everything in one place, so the students have one place to go with all the information, and they can communicate to us directly. So I think that's one of the key things. Again, systems challenges aside, at least if they can talk to you and tell their problem and get access to you straight away, you can then figure out the system bit in the back. But that has been phenomenally successful for us, and we've had a huge uptake in the app, and people engage, and I think that's important.
That's great. Thank you very much to our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, so I sodded up the big reveal. I apologise. Oh, I'm doing it again. We're going to have a break now. If you are interested in the Student Wellbeing and Living Monitor and would like to learn more, please go and find Scott. We have some refreshments on in the other room, so please, but you do have 15 minutes. I was going to say go and get some fresh air, but the heavens have opened. So enjoy your 15 minutes and we'll see you back in here. Thank you.
Moving from India felt very exciting because it was the first time I was going to Europe. It was very interesting to have a fresh outlook to a new society that I've never been to before. But once I did find the grassroots of how things work here, the systems like the public transport, everything else, things just became easier on their own.
I come from Ukraine. Right now I'm working with my friends from Ukraine to create a platform, like a website, that is going to be only fulfilled with Ukrainian brands. And our target audience would be European students and US students. My phone and my laptop mean everything.
I use it to communicate with a lot of people, especially back home in India.
I would have not been able to live without a Wi-Fi connection at all.
Where you go, we're on a mission to better the planet, to empower our students and support their holistic needs. Through research, taking in the views of tens of thousands of students, we understand what's needed from student living, and we want to help them live their best life, which we empower through our 3 pillars: You Go Eco, You Pro, and You Grow. But what do these mean? We are for students, with students, and by students. Through Yugo Eco, our students will help to drive our movement to eliminate single-use plastic. This program will take Yugo to the next level, partnering with our students and experts in their field to better the planet. Through UPro, we empower young people beyond higher education to help prepare them for their careers and wherever life may take them. To show our commitment to UPro, we've launched our very own student council, the Yugo Movement, where our students will be given one mission: to eliminate single-use plastic in our spaces. Our students will be supported by Yugoers around the world in setting goals, driving awareness, and most importantly, measuring their success. And at Yugo, we pledge to have 25% of all Yugoers as students and graduates by 2025. The Yugrow pillar is the student companion from day one. It's about creating spaces and experiences that support our students and Yugoers' holistic needs. We'll continue to offer our award-winning events with a new approach and collaborative input from everyone. New events inspired by our pillars will include clearing beaches, rivers, waterways, and raising money for water-related charities. There is so much more to come every month. Together, and only together, we can make a real impact.
The new gym, I believe, is better than what I thought it could be. I know there's a lot of hype about it, but yeah, it's definitely met my expectations. The new equipment is very up-to-date and high-tech, so it has a lot of the machines, especially the cardio ones, have the screens where you can go on Facebook, you can travel to different places while you're cycling, for example. So it gives you a lot of motivation.
It's a lot smoother, it's a lot more efficient, so just between changing weights, changing your position, especially with the resistance machines, it's a lot easier because it's so new, so it's almost like it's been oiled up. It's just really nice. I like it.
It's £20 for the academic year. No, that's reasonable price it is, because other gyms can be like £20 a month, stuff like that, so pretty cheap.
It is free for sports students like myself. So I use this gym every Monday within class, so it's great to get a workout whilst learning at the same time about all the new equipment and which muscles they use, etc.
It is a nice gym to use, especially if you're training with like novices and that. You can easily show them what to do, how to use different things. When they go off to other gyms, they know what to do as well. So it's a nice little like starting point. Come in whenever you want. So it's really easy to use. Really good place in the college. Anyone can get here within minutes.
Being a student, life is very busy. A lot of college work to do. So using the gym and having this available to our students, especially our sports ones, it's great to just come in hours such as like lunchtime or before college, after college, and get a workout in. Yeah, I would highly recommend this gym just because it offers so much. You've got resistance machines, cardio machines, you've got free weights, and there is actually, it will surprise you the amount of space there is, especially when there's a whole class in here.
You can work pretty much any part of your body, chest, back, legs, arms, anything really. If you know what you're going to do with the weight, then and you know how to do it safely, then you can work anything. Well, a lot of people talk about wanting to change, and especially if you've got this sort of place within your facilities, then just use it. Why not?
Moving from India felt very exciting because it was the first time I was going to Europe. It was very interesting to have a fresh outlook to a new society that I've never been to before. But once I did find the grassroots of how things work here, the systems like the public transport, everything else, things just became easier on their own.
I come from Ukraine. Right now I'm working with my friends from Ukraine to create a platform, like a website, that is going to be only fulfilled with Ukrainian brands. And our target audience would be European students and US students. My phone and my laptop mean everything.
I use it to communicate with a lot of people, especially back home in India.
I would have not be able to live without a Wi-Fi connection at all.
Where you go, we're on a mission to better the planet, to empower our students and support their holistic needs. Through research, taking in the views of tens of thousands of students, we understand what's needed from student living, and we want to help them live their best life, which we empower through our 3 pillars: You Go Eco, You Pro, and You Grow. But what do these mean? We are for students, with students, and by students. Through You Go Eco, our students will help to drive our movement to eliminate single-use plastic. This program will take YouGo to the next level, partnering with our students and experts in their field to better the planet. Through You Pro, we empower young people beyond higher education to help prepare them for their careers and wherever life may take them. To show our commitment to You Pro, we've launched our very own student council, the YouGo movement, where our students will be given one mission: to eliminate single-use plastic in our spaces. Our students will be supported by YouGoers around the world in setting goals, driving awareness, and most importantly, measuring their success. And at YouGo, we pledge to have 25% of all YouGoers as students and graduates by 2025. The YouGrow pillar is the student companion from day one. It's about creating spaces and experiences that support our students and YouGoers' holistic needs. We'll continue to offer our award-winning events with a new approach and collaborative input from everyone. New events inspired by our pillars will include clearing beaches, rivers, waterways, and raising money for water-related charities. There is so much more to come every month. Together, and only together, we can make a real impact.
The new gym, I believe, is better than what I thought it could be. I know there's a lot of hype about it, but yeah, it's definitely met my expectations. The new equipment is very up-to-date and high-tech, so it has a lot of the machines, especially the cardio ones, have the screens where you can go on Facebook, you can travel to different places while you're cycling, for example. So it gives you a lot of motivation.
It's a lot smoother, it's a lot more efficient, so between changing weights, changing your position, especially with the resistance machines, it's a lot easier because it's so new, so it's almost like it's been oiled up. It's just really nice. I like it.
It's £20 for the academic year. No, that's reasonable price it is, because other gyms can be like £20 a month, stuff like that, so pretty cheap.
It is free for sports students like myself. So I use this gym every Monday within class, so it's great to get a workout whilst learning at the same time about all the new equipment and which muscles they use, etc.
It is a nice gym to use, especially if you're training with like novices and that, you can easily show them what to do, how to use different things when they go off to other gyms and know what to do as well. So it's a nice little like starting point. Come in whenever you want, so it's really easy to use, really good place in the college. Anyone can get here within minutes.
Being a student, life is very busy, a lot of college work to do, so using the gym and having this available to our students, especially our sports ones, it's great to just come in hours such as like lunchtime or before college, after college, and get a workout in. Yeah, I would highly recommend this gym just because it offers so much. You've got resistance machines, cardio machines, you've got free weights, and there is actually, it will surprise you the amount of space there is, especially when there's a whole class in here.
You can work pretty much any part of your body, chest, back, legs, arms, anything really. If you know what you're going to do with the weight, then and you know how to do it safely, then you can work anything. Well, a lot of people talk about wanting to change, and especially if you've got this sort of place within your facilities, then just use it. Why not?
Hi, ladies and gentlemen, please make your way back into the main room. We're now going to start with the final panel and the data insight. Yes? Do we need... ready to start? Yeah? Holding the clicker upside down, helpful. Oh, I know. There's a lot of hope for you. Okay, ladies and gentlemen that are stood outside, please make your way back in. We're about to start. I'm going to welcome David Feeney up to the stage, who is going to give us a data insight on the UK and Ireland.
Thanks, Kellyanne. That's up to you. Okay.
You've got a figure that says something like 21% more people are living away from home or something in your student experience.
I'll have a look.
I don't think it's true. So,
there's loads of typos in there. The marketing guys say you've got one shot at it these days.
More people are living away from home. It's either 21% or 23% more.
Sounds like a little rubbish.
Because you couldn't work out where you'd got that from.
All right, I'll check it out.
But I'll give you a ring anyway. I've been meaning to give you a ring. I've been mentioning you all week, and because I thought...
Well, you've led me in very well today.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Well, you're the man. I thought the new report was good, actually.
Thanks.
Which I read properly to do research. I thought, well, because you don't want to say anything that's obviously wrong, or where you just think, well, you know, there's such a divergence of opinion.
Everything you said comes out of the stats, so it's brilliant.
I think some universities are now surprised. They're getting surprised.
Yeah, they are. Yeah. And then you blew their minds.
Yeah. Well, Manchester's a black hole. And they're hiding, by the way. They didn't fill in the accommodation cost survey. You know, they screwed up over COVID. They screwed up over COVID, and they've completely buggered up their intakes. And it's not happy, you know. I mean, what's
ready to go?
Yeah. What's interesting is, at the moment, the private sector is doing better than you get that feeling, don't you? Right, anyway, good luck.
Thank you.
You're going to do a proper presentation. That's what I was.
Thanks, everyone.
Hi guys, I know you all want to catch up and chat, and that's wonderful, but Dave is now going to speak, and then we're all going to go to a bar later, and you can continue doing this, okay? Fabulous.
Thanks, Kellyanne. I'll fire through so we can all get to the pub. A lot of positivity in this presentation, which I think amidst economic turmoil is good for us all and shows that there's a lot of resilience in the sector. As usual, I'll talk about demand, supply, markets in a bit of detail. I'll look ahead, and then a little bit on Ireland. So starting with demand, well, let's look at the full-time student population. And I've called this huge recovery, but I think it's more appropriate to say that it's huge resilience. And what we've seen for 2020-21, which is the first partially post-COVID year, is that student numbers were up 8% on the previous year. And to place that in some sort of context, that's far higher than the 5.7% we saw in 07-08. Obviously, students were looking to upskill, job opportunities, travel opportunities were pretty limited. But to be honest, I'll talk about it in a moment, the evidence for 2021-22 is also very, very strong. And I think a lot of what Martin said was really interesting about postgraduates at lower ranked universities and, you know, them choosing lower cost postgraduate courses. And what we saw was that postgraduates accounted for 40% of all growth in 2020-21, which is unprecedented. We saw new international postgraduates up by over 6.5%, and perhaps there were a number of international postgrads that were seeing this as, I can do a one-year course in the UK but not really be in the UK due to the visa waiver system. But I think the fundamentals there are very, very strong. And in terms of what's actually happened in terms of internationals being in the UK, we still don't know the full picture. So what we can look to is the visa issuances, student visas. And 2021 saw an 80% increase in what we saw in 2019. And I think that's massively positive for us all. There are a lot of nuances there. Chinese increase was only 2% compared to a 48% increase in Indian students. All the things about zero COVID, lack of Chinese travel certainly impacted the market, and I think we'll see a big Chinese bounce back for 2022-23. We always talk about winners and losers at Cushman & Wakefield, and this is absolutely entrenched at undergraduate level now. Martin alluded to it earlier. Russell Group acceptances are up 23% in 5 years, and the bottom 25 ranked universities have lost 8% of their undergraduate intake over the same period. If you look at this list of universities, it's not the best of the best. It's not all Russell Groups. You see universities that have got USP, such as Anglia Ruskin, that have really managed to increase their undergraduate population. And perhaps those universities that haven't really got a USP to say to the market, they're the ones that are struggling at the bottom end. However, what's happening at the bottom now, this is really fascinating, and again, it builds on what Martin said earlier. So these columns show growth at universities ranked 1 to 25 over the past 5 years. And then we see this kind of squeezed middle ground at 26 to 50. And then as we go lower down the league tables, we see massive, massive growth in student numbers. And overall, growth at bottom 25 universities is far outstripping that at the top end, which is probably surprising to a lot of people. 107% increase in internationals in 5 years at the bottom 25 ranked universities. And overall, market growth is just massively, massively strong. 24 universities have increased student numbers by 5,000 or more in just 5 years. So 1,000 a year, incredible. But I would say proceed with caution, and this growth at the bottom end does not necessarily translate through to demand for beds. So this chart is really interesting, and it's typical of what's happening at these lower ranked universities. So the kind of bluey green bar is 18-year-olds over time at this institution, and the kind of yellowy coloured line is students aged 30 or over. And what's happened, again, referring back to what Martin said, is undergraduate demand's being hollowed out, and it's being replaced by much older students. And this, as I've said, this doesn't translate to accommodation demand, because if you're over 30, it's very unlikely you're going to try and live in, traditional purpose-built products. And again, between China and India, we've got a massive world of difference. So this shows growth in the Chinese and Indian population over the past 5 years by the top 25 ranked universities and those ranked in the bottom 25. So you can see that Chinese students in the top 25 institutions have grown by about 50,000 students in 5 years, but Indian students have only grown by about 4,000. And again, what's really, really interesting at the bottom end is, as Martin said, a lot of these Indians are coming over here to do a postgraduate course. They're looking to live and study very, very cheaply. And we've seen a 20,000 increase in 5 years. The visa system allows them to work in the UK after they graduate, but they haven't got the spending power that the Chinese population has. Just a little bit on growth and investment, and I think it's really, really positive for the sector. So the green column shows spend on campus facilities between 2015 and 2020. And as we can see, beyond 2020, over the next 5 years, we're going to see a continued increase in spending on campus facilities. Over 7 billion planned to 2025. Huge investment in STEM, perhaps what we would expect. The UK government expects this area to grow the economy. However, the massive growth in student numbers continues to come from business and social science subjects. It's a lot cheaper to teach these. It's a lot easier to get these students into big lecture theatres. So it'll be interesting to see if we start to see this investment in STEM really translate to student number growth. What's the position for 2022-23? So this shows UCAS acceptances over time by tariff band of university. And really, we're looking at that kind of green line again, and it shows about an 8% decrease in acceptances to high-ranked institutions, probably what we would expect given we've returned to a normal exam system this year. Positively, international acceptance is up 12.4%. And I think what's quite heartening for the sector is that acceptances overall are still 1.6% higher than during the last exam season. And if we say that a lot of the growth in student numbers is now coming from postgrads, I think 2022-23 will see the highest number of students on record. Moving on to supply. This column here, it shows new deliveries over time, and what we're seeing is a dramatic slowdown in the delivery of new beds. So in 2017-18, we saw about 33,000 new beds delivered to the market. For 2022-23, we're at about 18,000 beds. And this doesn't really tell the whole story. So what we've seen this year is 10,000 beds leave the market. So what we're getting really is just an 8,000 net increase in beds, and it's just not enough to keep up with growth in demand. I want to talk a little bit about premium products. So we rank the quality level of every bed in the country from 1 to 5, where 1 is the lowest and 5 is the highest. And what we've seen over the past, well, since 2013, is that rental growth in premium assets will outperform all other areas over the longer term. So we're talking about 5-star assets like the one we're sat in today, ones that really deliver the great student experience. So we hear a lot about affordability issues in the market, but those that can afford the top-end product that deliver the best student experience, they're really, really performing very strongly. In terms of where the rental growth is by agreement type, direct let beds, rental growth is about 0.75% a year lower than in long-term partnership agreements. And I think this shows what has happened in the market in those competitive locations like Sheffield and Liverpool. Rental growth in direct let beds has really stalled due to the level of competition. And I think it'll be really interesting during the rent setting process over the next few weeks, whether these on-campus partnerships really push it, whether direct let providers can really push it, and whether we'll start to see a growing gap between the two over time. Just to talk through a few markets in detail, again, as we always say, you have to know your markets in this sector. And this chart here shows headroom movements over time. So really, we're looking at the green line again, and that shows a massive growth in headroom in Bristol. So headroom's up 43% in 5 years, and new beds are only growing at about 18%. The other side of the coin, Ian's market, Sheffield. Headroom down by 30%. The students' bed ratio is beyond saturation level, and there's huge difficulties there. And Nottingham, headroom up 36%, and that will tell in the pipeline statistics that I'll talk about in a moment. In terms of long-term performance, I've just picked out a few interesting markets. So since 2013-14, growth in the rush home area of Manchester is about 27%. Manchester massively undersupplied with beds, as we've seen in the media over the last week, and massively undersupplied with quality accommodation. So providers are really able to push rental growth and still get high occupancy. Dundee, perhaps the best under the radar market in the country, rental growth of about 34% over this period. People are just waking up to the fact that this is a good university, it's a good market, and it needs beds. And the obvious one that I think everyone knows about, Bristol city centre, continues to absolutely fly. On the other side of the coin, Newcastle, the Manors area of the city, rents down about 13%. And Coventry, the market that's seen the biggest influx of beds over the past 5 years, certainly, the Coventry University area, rents have come off by 20%, and it just shows the pressures on occupancy in the Coventry market at the moment. But micro-location is absolutely crucial, and I've just mentioned the difficulties we see in Sheffield, and you might think it's difficult across the whole market, but that's not the case. So if you're in the West Bar or Castlegate area of Sheffield, your rents will probably be about 10% lower than they were 8-9 years ago. But if you're in the northwest city centre area of the city, close to the University of Sheffield, rents are up 12%. And there's about a 500 metre difference between these two areas, and that shows how sensitive location is in these cities. So to summarise where the market is at for 2022-23, rental growth at the moment is about 3.42% by half year. And what we've seen in Q3 is providers continue to push rents on by about 0.8%. 39 of 41 major markets have seen rental growth, and that's certainly something we haven't seen for about 5 years. And 6 of these markets have seen rental growth above 5%. So just to pick out a couple of interesting ones, Belfast, a market that's now really starting to appreciate the benefits of purpose-built accommodation, certainly compared to the very poor HMO market there. Rents up over 7.5%. Glasgow, one of the ones we've all heard about in terms of difficulties in the HMO market, a lot of returners getting into purpose-built accommodation. Rents up over 7%. Bristol continues to perform very strongly. Cardiff is recovering very well from the difficulties we saw in 17-18. And Leicester's an interesting one that's actually seen rents fall. De Montfort has certainly struggled over the past few years in the face of market competition. And Aberdeen is finally starting to recover after 6-7 years of massive difficulties. A rebasing of rents, growth at the universities, and certainly University of Aberdeen getting a lot of postgraduates through the door has certainly helped there. Just to look ahead, in terms of the development pipeline, the column on the left shows about 28,000 beds entering the pipeline in 2021. And by the half-year period in 2022, we saw about 8,000 beds entering the pipeline. So the market's definitely being impacted by uncertainty. Site availability, making things stack up, is a huge issue. But we're forecasting there could be up to 29,000 new deliveries for 2023-24, which is interesting as we come through COVID and construction really starts to build up again. But I think long-term, in terms of a slowing of new deliveries, we will continue to see that. And just to look at a couple of pipelines, London, the largest in the country, whether those will eventually be built and whether they can secure agreements with institutions remains to be seen. The second one there is Nottingham, which is responding to that massive growth in headroom that I mentioned earlier. I want to talk a little bit about pricing and segmentation in the market. So these columns show the annual average rent across these markets for exactly the same quality of room, so a mid-range private ensuite room. And as you can see, for a good quality ensuite, you will be paying about £2,800 a year more in Bristol, Bath and Brighton than you'll be paying in Cardiff, Liverpool, Nottingham or Sheffield. And we know these students are in receipt of the very same maintenance loan, and it begs the question, are we going to start to see students really make choices as to which university to go to based on the price of PBSA in these markets? Very quickly on HMOs, the Renters Reform Bill, the proposed ban on fixed-term tenancies, will landlords be unable to guarantee availability? Obviously, it's proposed that PBSA is exempt from that bill. Other headwinds, we certainly heard stories about COVID continuing to impact on students willing to share in some HMOs. And obviously, the immediate impacts of energy costs are being passed on to students in the vast majority of these. And certainly, there's lessons from Scotland in terms of a contracting rental market and difficulties meeting accommodation guarantees. So if we're only seeing 8,000 new deliveries net and we're seeing a reduction in the HMO market due to these kind of policies, then we've got a very, very difficult situation. In terms of other market headwinds, in terms of tender price inflation, Cushman & Wakefield's forecasting 6.5% this year, 4.5% in 2023, and then things starting to calm down by 2024. In terms of energy and water, in terms of your op costs, rising from £450 to over £600 a bed, obviously impacts massively. And at the extreme end, we've seen some op costs go from £1,400 a bed to over £2,200. Very quickly, a couple of key questions. How are we going to see the forthcoming cycles play out? I think it's interesting that the UK government has said undergraduate fees are going to be frozen until at least 2025. Is it really good for quality universities to be recruiting undergrads when they can get postgrads through the door? In terms of that sustainability of postgraduate demand, I think it's relatively unproven. Can these institutions continue taking on at the bottom end of the league tables 3,000 plus Indian and Pakistani students every single year? In terms of the affordability question, more students from disadvantaged backgrounds. And in terms of a summary of supply, there is a slowdown in development. We've got hostile local authorities in some locations, and there is massive pressure on that HMO sector.
Awesome. I don't think we've got time for questions, but what we can do is we can share this. I've already said we can share it now, so maybe we can share this afterwards, and then if anybody has any questions, they can email us, and we can put you in contact.
Yep, happy to talk.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, David. Really, really interesting, and there's definitely some really interesting trends that seem to be happening there across the board in the UK, especially in those particular pressure points in different cities. So we're going to have our final session of the day, which covers the state of student living in the UK and Ireland. So I would like to invite up the panel, please. Thank you, Sam.
Thank you very much. I think, are we going to try and sit or stand? I've got terrible socks on, so apologies for those in the front row.
This one's Sam? Okay, that's fine. I just wanted to mention before we start speaking, for the people at home, there might be a kind of crackling sound. We have a glass roof, and it's been raining quite heavily here, despite what I've been wearing. So it might sound a little bit strange, but yeah, there's nothing weird going on. It's just the rain.
We need to change. Okay, welcome to the final session in today's regional forum. This is the operators and investors panel. My name is Sam Bailey-Watts, and I work as a consultant in the higher education sector, having worked for nearly 30 years for a couple of universities in the UK, and also with a major operation developer and operator for some years. So I'm delighted to be joined by four titans of the sector. Are you okay with that? Yeah. Like Martin and Kellyanne, there is some history between me and three of the panelists. Mark, to my right, will be dealing with investment and lending today. John Wakeford, to my far right, HE policy. And then Paul, the next to me, an architect who's standing. Brilliant. He's standing, great. And then Maria, who we don't have any history until today, so it's an interesting day for you. I'm far too old, thank you. Good, so without further ado, I think it would be good just to, for you each to introduce yourselves, and I'll start with you, Maria, if I may, as the host today as well.
Thank you very much. My microphone's not, oh no, it is working. Hello everybody, I'm Maria Hatch, and the Client Relationship Director for Greystar across UK and Ireland, covering both the student and multifamily side of the business. I've been with Greystar just over 6 years now, and I've worked across the PBSA industry for I think about 12 years, working in both the university sector and then coming across to PBSA. So that's an introduction from me. Over to Paula.
Is it working? Yeah. Hi, my name's Paula Wilmore. I'm a founder director of Wilmore Isles Architects. We started working with a student accommodation scheme in 1998, and we've worked for the past 23 years on student accommodation across England, and working with our partners, UPP right at the beginning and still now, we have helped them to deliver over 22,000 beds in that time.
My name is Mark Quigley. I'm the Managing Director of Beaufort Capital. We provide development finance for real estate developers, any real estate asset class anywhere in Great Britain. My history in this sector started just a year after Paula's, 1999-2000. And I got involved with some schemes back then, started doing them sort of side of the desk activity. It then became my full-time job. My main career was at Barclays Bank. I was there for 31 years. And during that time, as I say, did an awful lot of student accommodation, particularly during the global financial crisis when no other part of the bank was lending any money for development finance, and I was fortunate enough to be able to do so then. More recently, I've been involved, I've been at Beaufort for 4.5 years. We hadn't previously done any student accommodation deals until I joined, but the first transaction I did was a student scheme in Glasgow, funnily enough, near where I used to go to school, so that was quite a nice tie-up there. But since that time, we've funded a lot of developments. We want to do more, very keen on the sector, and looking forward to talking to you about it today. Thank you.
I'm John Wakeford. My current role at UBP Group Holdings is Director of Engagement and Investor Relations. I started in student accommodation in the mid-90s in operational roles for Goldsmiths College and the University of London Intercollegiate System. I joined UPP in 99-2000, and I've also been at KPMG doing their higher education lead. During my time at UPP, obviously I've been involved in many of their large transactions. I was involved in the sale of the company to their current investors, PGGM, and also I was involved in the bond issuance and their conversion to a REIT and their listing on the International Stock Exchange.
Thanks, panelists. The title of today is The State of Student Living, and we've been asked to talk about that from the perspective from the 4 areas that we've already referred to. So I think it might be worth giving some little context to David's very helpful data that was coming forward, and we don't aim to burst the balloon of the positive views of Cushman and Wakefield, but I'm sure we'll be able to debate some of the elements. So we have some specific questions, but in the first instance, it might be worth us just discussing a little bit about each of the panelists' views on what's happening currently in the UK and Ireland, and how we can answer that question as comprehensively as we can within about 2.5 minutes. John, you could start, please.
Okay, so how do I see the market at the moment? Well, I've just come down from the UUK conference today, along with Jenny and others, and I have to say the demand side of the market is looking very encouraging. I think HEPI have identified this potential growth of 350,000 new student places in the next decade. On top of that, you've got an extra target of 600,000 international students, full-time international students, under the current government's international strategy. So I think obviously that's really quite, a good picture. I suppose the devil here is whether the government are going to allow the sector to grow at that level. There was some discussion today at the conference about the participation rate, which is currently in the sort of 50% area. There was discussion about whether that should be able to grow to 70%. And at 70%, that's where that 350,000 kicks in. I think there are some potential showstoppers. And I think the showstoppers are firstly the state of university finances, and I think university finances are really going to struggle. They're struggling at the moment, but they're going to struggle even further. And that's been brought about pretty much by the freezing of tuition fee caps over the last 5 years. So the unit of resource that universities have to teach has been falling consistently. Teaching grants have been reduced. I think you've got the issue of inflation, obviously, eating away at that. So the actual value of that 9,250 is now back at the level it was in 2006. So universities find themselves very financially constrained. Now that, I suppose, could work two ways. Either it means that universities, as Martin was talking about earlier on, will be more inclined to go out to PBSA operators, direct let PBSA operators, or they may well choose to come to companies like UPP with large, more master plan type activities. I don't know which way that's going to land at the moment. I guess the other issue that, and again, one that Martin referred to, was about what's going on in terms of the planning environment. David referred to the renters reform bill, which may well take a lot of HMOs out of the market. So I think in terms of the requirement for supply, I think it's very high. In fact, I would go so far to say is. I think if we're not there yet, then we could be in a significant supply crisis in quite a lot of cities across the UK. So I think that's fine. I'll shut up now.
You're okay. You're okay.
That's fine. All I would say to that is that the planning environment has been getting more and more hostile. You know, the use of Article 4 directives and other such. Methods to sort of stop operators developing in cities and reduce HMO, the number of HMOs, I think, is a critical factor in that. So I think there's going to be a supply squeeze coming very shortly.
It was a friendly glance towards you. It wasn't intimidating.
It was a first.
I think probably the tail end of that neatly passes on to you, Paula, from a planning perspective. So would you like to give your thoughts?
Yes, absolutely. So I've come at it from a design point of view, and I've picked on about 3 key areas which I think we're noticing that we're dealing with, which I think tie into the operational side of PBSA specifically, but all areas of it. So if I take the regulatory framework first, we're all aware of Grenfell and the Building Safety Bill, and that has had some impacts on how we design and what we're doing at the moment. Probably all positive, but it probably adds costs to build. From a planning point of view, I think the biggest thing that we're noticing is that planning authorities in various places around the country, so I'm not going to talk about HIMOs, I'm talking about PBSA building schemes in city centres or indeed on university campuses. Planning authorities are driving the sustainability agenda. They are talking about, the government signed up to, I think they still signed up to it at the moment, the 2050 net zero carbon pledge, a legal requirement. Somewhere like Exeter City Council is really pushing the sustainability agenda, and some of the universities are following as well. They see it as part of who they are and what they should be doing. And that's translating to the designs that we're doing. And we're doing a lot of work around Passive House, on the new builds, Enefit, on the refurbishment, and those are all really interesting because they're all about end user health and well-being. You know, that is something that is fascinating and ties into what you're going to talk about, but also BREEAM, WELL, all those other things. That's happening in design. It's going to get more and more on your PBSA works, whether you're refurbishing or new building in the future. Another thing we've noticed is that for 2 reasons, well, we're an asset class that's been going for so long now. We've got buildings that are no longer fit for purpose. And so quite a lot of our clients are coming to us and saying, look, I've got a building that I want to buy, but it isn't doing all the things that we need it to do from student experience and supporting health and well-being. And so what can we do? And so we're doing a lot of that, and that's fascinating and really interesting and my key area. And also we are, the other thing, of course, is that we're having a retail nightmare at the moment. So there are a lot of landlords out there who've got city centre buildings with retail and they don't know what to do with them. They might be able to use the retail at ground floor, but they're thinking about what they might do above. And residential is going back into the cities, and part of that is student accommodation. And that's great. It's sort of increasing vibrancy. But I've covered sustainability. I've covered that. I'm just checking checking I've covered everything I wanted to say. I think so. I think on the legal requirements around sustainability, it's coming, finally, probably a bit too late, and the EPC ratings are a requirement now on buildings, so that's part of it as well. So it's really exciting times, but it's just even more challenging than it's ever been before.
Thanks, Paula. Maria, can I move on to you?
Thank you very much. I think to echo some of the words that Paula was saying, for us, obviously, the demand this year has been incredible, and hope it continues for the future. I think it has allowed the opportunity for mindsets to change slightly, and that it seems to have been a theme throughout today, and a theme that the class holds very dearly, but the community piece. And I think it's allowing particularly people like me in my role to work with people like Paula to design and look at spaces that really match the student needs. I think it's very important for the end game and for everybody in the room really to remember that the students, are always going to be the prime user here and should always be at the forefront. Should always be at the forefront of our minds. So for me, it's very much opening up those channels between sort of like Paula, the PBSAs, and again, the universities. And I think this year has shown us there's a huge, it's imperative actually that universities, PBSAs, and everybody work together whether or not they've got agreements in place or not to improve the student experience. And to the point earlier made about data sharing agreements and the welfare of the students. These students are checking into buildings like this or, like a lot of us run. And I think it's really important to have amenity spaces, not so that we just have them, but amenity spaces that, are there for their use. And so quiet study spaces people can socialise and feel like they're listened to and they have a home. That's really key. One thing that we learned out of COVID, I'm sure everybody did, is that nobody wanted to be locked in a room again or felt like they couldn't be part of a community. And a community very much starts in a building, and it doesn't just mean the building, it means the local community, the local universities, local businesses. We deal at Greystar with a lot of international students, particularly in London. I think it's key that they feel like they have a community when they get here. Should we be working with more secondary schools to understand, the mental health issues before students get here? Should we be working with 16, 17-year-olds to understand the future needs of the students that we have coming up? And Paula and I have spoken about this previously, and they're the people that we should be listening to, and they're the voices that should be heard, because ultimately they're the people that are paying the bills and they're going to be living in our buildings. So that's where I think student accommodation is.
Before we move on to Mark, importantly, at these forums, these events on an annual basis, there seems to be probably a lack of connection with our university partners and students, etc. How, during the COVID time in particular, but since then, has Greystar looked at its relationships with the higher education sector, and have you seen a greater desire by universities to engage with you on various subjects such as well-being and just general operational practice?
Yeah, absolutely. I think during COVID, everybody actually in the industry and university-wise, I felt, came together and started sharing lessons learned and best practice, and everybody did do that quite openly. I think the need for university relationships is now more important than ever. That started, on March the 23rd when we went into lockdown. It was very much, what is everybody going to be doing and how are we going to be acting? I think there's a huge need for everybody to collaborate in that way. We've seen a change with not just the Russell Group universities, but if you take sort of, like a UCL all the way down to maybe a small language school, how we work with people. I don't think it matters if you have 700 students from one university or 2 students from a language school. The relationship should be the same, because a person is a person. So I think that we saw a huge amount of reach out from the HEI side and also from our side to engage in a very different way. And that's what I mean, pre-COVID, perhaps those relationships were there because of nominations or referral agreements. So there was a financial side to that agreement. It wasn't a commercial agreement. I think now the agreement is based around the student well-being more than the financial commitment, which is great to see.
Good. Thank you very much. Maria, on to Mark.
I'm going to approach this from a different angle, if I may. If I go back in time, and you've heard that a number of us started in this at the turn of the millennium, the world was a very strange place in terms of what we were doing for our students. And it was deemed appropriate that the best way of looking after them was just building cluster studios, 6 beds with a shared kitchen, squeeze in as many as you possibly can, and that was it. And that's how it started, and a number of the main players did exactly that. Then we began to realise and understand a bit better that the rabbit hutch approach was not the ideal way. We moved away from just doing clusters, we moved into doing studios, townhouses, duplexes, all manner of different combinations. We've now got clusters with 6 beds, 8 beds, 20 beds, and everything in between. So that's moved on incredibly. And I look at this sector and think how incredibly resilient it's been for all these years. We've been through goodness knows how many things. Obviously the global financial crisis, the global pandemic, we've had snap elections, we've had prime ministers ousted and goodness knows what. And throughout all of this, every now and then there might be a bit of an issue, but the sector has dusted itself down, gone again. The comments that were made about the various areas that have had saturation issues, they're well made and they're true. But yet again, we've seen in most of those areas, after a period of 2 or 3 years, they've digested new stock, they've sorted themselves out, they've gone again. But let's look at some of the fundamentals, because I don't think any of these have really changed. Back in the day, 20 years ago, there was this thought, build it and they will come. And to some extent, you could be forgiven for thinking that, because there was no other choice. It was either crumbling stock on the university's estate or some sort of PBSA somewhere. But in property, and I've been lending in property for 2 or 3 decades now, the fundamental's still the same, location, location, location. I'd go a step further now and say it's all about micro-location. So it's all very well to say, I'll just build it in Sheffield or Liverpool or Newcastle, but where is it in Sheffield, Liverpool and Newcastle? So for me, understanding those initial dynamics of what makes sense, what I'm looking to do is support good people building good schemes in good locations. There's nothing more exciting than that. But trying to get that is often a challenge. This is a tricky and complex sector to get involved in. But once you're involved and truly understand it, I mean, you can see the successes over many, many decades now, as I say. So I'd look at what we've got at the moment. I'd take a view that there will still be great opportunity for many years to come, but it's remembering all the basics still. What are we providing? Where are we providing it? And as you absolutely rightly say, who is the end user of this? And when mum and dad rock up with Flossie and Johnny, you know, age 17, 18, leaving home for the first time, and are able to see and touch and look at these buildings and think, well, what's it going to be like for them when they leave home? And proper amenity space, well thought out, quiet rooms, as you say. People now, if you're going to be spending, you know, £50,000 over a university career, to walk away having had an experience where you've not been able to study properly or you've not been able to have good leisure facilities or whatever, is a massive issue. So I think that there's plenty of opportunity, but we need to remember those absolute fundamental basics.
Thanks, Mark. I guess in response to that, Mark, the question might be, and I think again, in some of these forums, we don't talk quite as openly as we could, but where many operators, universities will be looking towards the rent setting cycle for academic year 23-24. A lot of them are RPI-based increases, inflationary increases. So as a lender, there's still great optimism, and I think in a recent article, you commented on PBSA still being the golden ticket in terms of investment. But how does the climate change now? We've heard about the Scottish price freeze on accommodation more generally, which ends in March, so probably won't affect the PBSA sector. But if you were, looking to put some equity in some of these deals, at the current stage, and John might have a thought on this as well, but is it quite as encouraging a picture for the next few years as it has been in previous years?
Well, I've got to say that I'm still very positive about the sector, and for a number of I think, genuinely good reasons. But it all boils down to what you're doing and where you're doing it. And it seems to me that too many people for too long have taken a view that, build something and it should sort itself out without truly understanding. But I think that if you select your market carefully, do your due diligence, work out what's needed and where, then there's plenty of opportunity. The equity piece is an interesting one because we've seen so many properties changing hands at vast amounts of money with tighter and tighter yields that, you could be forgiven for thinking that we would never see the like, but we have and we continue to do. If I take borrowing rates, for example, I heard somebody say the other day, they rang into Radio 5 Live or Radio 4, whatever it was, and said, these are the highest rates on record, and this is base rate as it is today. Now, I lived through and worked through base rate at 15%. So, relatively speaking, of course, they're not anywhere near that. At the same time, as part and parcel of looking at these things as a banker, we want to make sure that people can afford them, so that when they borrow money from us and we add our interest to that, they can afford to repay us. But we build all of that in, we build in sufficient contingencies and so on, and we make our assessment based on what we know when we know it. We don't take a view, if you think a lot of lenders, and indeed we've seen quite a few do this, have sort of run to the hills, global pandemic, Ukraine war, all manner of things that have happened in recent times. The difficulty is if you do that, you can very quickly close down a business. And the other thing I'd say is that when somebody comes knocking on my door and says, Mark, I'd like to borrow some money to build this student scheme. So he or she will tell me that's what they want to do, and we'll start talking. By the time we've agreed to lend the money, they've got on site. In some cases, they've obviously had to work up their planning permission and so on, and they've started building it, and there's an end use of that. 2 or 3 years, or indeed more, may have passed. So you're trying to always second guess what the future looks like. And as part and parcel of this, trying to, as I say, where I think the sector has been so incredibly resilient is being able to change, understand what's needed, move with the times and so on. So from an equity perspective, we provide equity, we provide mezz, and we provide senior debt. From any of the above, we're still very comfortable. But we're not going into it with a blindfold on. We understand there are challenges. The labour cost, getting labour and the cost of labour, materials, and again, getting hold of materials is a challenge as well, and the inflation levels that we've seen. But at the same time, understanding all of that, building all of that in, building in sufficient leeway to make sure that you're going to be safe, that's all part and parcel. But I take a great deal of comfort from the fact that far smarter people than me have been investing in this sector for years and years and years, and continue to do so. The transactions that have been moving hands are eye-watering.
Thanks. John?
Yeah, I was actually going to, without assuming the role of the chair, I was going to ask Mark a question about the difference between the sort of capital market investors and the sort of banks, in terms of, you've seen how the sort of 30-year gilts moved 230 basis points in the last year and 100 basis points in the last month. What do you think? Do you think there's going to be a shakeout of those types of investors, the large pension funds and insurance companies?
I think common sense says that naturally there will have to be a shakeout, as you say. But when it will happen and how it will happen and how long they would be out of the market remains to be seen. But if I take the view of what's happened, notwithstanding the headwinds I've discussed, over now at least a decade of seeing foreign money coming into this country, specifically for PBSA, it is quite astonishing. So I take the view that I suspect there will be a time when we may see a few taps switched off, but at the moment that seems to be plentiful. And I think the other thing is that what we're seeing now is, rather than sort of one-hit wonders, companies are taking the view that they're in here for a period of time, they're buying up big portfolios, they're looking to really work the assets, add value as best they can, and at some stage move on. But it never ceases to amaze me how big companies move assets that they've had their time with and move them on to other big companies, and so it goes on. And I think the art of trying to make money from a property developer's perspective is being able to find those sites, build those assets, offload those, possibly in a small portfolio, and then move on again. And we've seen many operators do that and do it incredibly successfully.
Thanks. Thanks, Mark and John. We're going to change track slightly and move back onto the design perspective. And I think probably we all hear a great deal about construction is one of the biggest problems in terms of the sustainability piece. Wilmore Isles, what's your thoughts on things?
Just picking up from what Mark said about pension funding, I think we've noticed, I mean, we're a long way away, further away than Mark is, but we've noticed that our funders are thinking about the ESG conversation, particularly pension funds, and they're starting to, because as I said to you before, I think sustainability is rolling down the line, and I think that through the regulatory framework, government requirements, we are going to have to up our game on the way that we design and build accommodation. In terms of what I do specifically, and I mentioned it briefly earlier, is I sort of focus a lot in what we at Wilmore Isles. We do a lot of new build student accommodation, but I tend to focus on refurbishment and extension of existing buildings. And that is, a highly sustainable approach to life. If you're going to be working in the cities and you've got existing buildings in brownfield areas and you can redevelop them and extend them, you can do that. You're starting off in a sustainable way. I mean, I have to say, it would be great if the government would do something about VAT on existing buildings, because that usually blows the financial model out immediately. But if we could get something, and I know people are campaigning on this, where it was on a par with new builds, or even lower than it is at the moment, that would be good. But the bit that I was just going to talk about was this thing around passive house, which I'm sure you've all heard about, and the residential element of that, which is Enefit. And Enefit is a system, a way of designing and building an existing building, and it's all around end user comfort. So at the end of the day, if you're prepared to spend more capex cost on it, your operational costs will come down if you do a whole life building analysis, and your students will be happier because they will have better ventilation, they'll have better air quality, they will have better acoustics, and theoretically, alongside all the other stuff which is vitally important around the well-being, it will be a better environment for them to live in and to learn in. Because that's the other bit I wanted to say, was that we've noticed, and it was touched on by people in previous presentations, and I don't need to go over it again, but students now want something between their bedroom, possibly the kitchen, living, dining room, and the university library. And the hierarchy of spaces, the social spaces, this sort of thing, smaller spaces where they can learn and work together and do communal working as well as socializing, is a key part of PBSA. And that, combined with a better way of designing, which I think is Enefit, or something equivalent, is the way that we should be going. I genuinely believe that. But
Maria, would you like to pick up on that point with regard to the live and learning piece? Because I think that's I was involved in probably with Paula and John some years ago with respect to designing new space. Now this was probably 15 years ago. Yeah, with an American prof at one of our partner universities, who was very clear that the disconnect between residential accommodation and the academic space wasn't where it should be, and we've seen over the last 15 years a huge change in that, which has contributed to better thinking around well-being, and it takes into consideration the mental health piece. Maria, from your perspective, the next step, and we can see here we're in a phenomenal student build. What's your thoughts on moving forward in terms of the community? What changes have you seen even in the last few years?
Yeah, I think for me the next step, I'll start there again. I think data is key with our student body and the residents that live in our building. And what I mean by that is, listening to survey responses, having human interaction and speaking to the students to understand what they want is so important. To Paula's point and your point around sort of living and learning, I think the ease of living in a PBSA building being able to separate your bedroom to an amenity space that you can socialise with friends or make friends and feel understood, and then go to a university all within ease and feel at home is incredibly important. So I think there's a few things here: understanding the students before they get to us, listening to their voice when they are with us, and proactively showing the students that we are doing that. So I mean, this space is incredible, and you know, a lot of PBSAs globally and you know, London regionally are incredible. But if you don't listen to the student voice, it is just a space, right? So this is a great auditorium, but if we're not listening to what the students are saying, it is just a great auditorium. So I think that's really important. And I think the next step is understanding. So understanding your demographic, listening to the student voice. And ultimately, I think understanding their year of study is hugely important. So I use international postgrads as an example. A lot of international postgrads come over to the UK for maybe 1 year and haven't actually studied in the UK for their undergraduate course. I don't know as an industry if we do enough to look at the other side of that postgraduate course. So, you know, you finish your exams in May, what do you do? You've been chucked into London for a year. You haven't lived in London before. There's a huge amount of pressure to do well in your postgraduate course, whether it be 1 or 2 years. And I think, you know, going back to sort of the, Darren's comments from Nido earlier, we really need to understand the mental health space and not just acknowledge that that's a problem, but understand why that's a problem and understand the stresses that students are in pre, during and post their stay with us. And then work again with people like Paula to make that sort of bedroom, amenity space, university space, a journey that they enjoy rather than one that they feel like they have to endure. And I think that's where you start to see students feel like they're part of a community, and I think that's when you start to see students rebook and feel like they have a home.
That's great. Thank you very much. I think just on the point around the engagement with universities, and there's a couple of people here representing universities today, that I think on these sorts of panels, getting more and more people involved who are involved in this centrally within universities is critical. It's probably a question for the class to be considering in the future, is that engagement piece with higher education institutions, which leads me on to John as a board director of UPP for many years. That partnership model has been fairly critical to the success of UPP over the years. But how have you seen that partnership changing, John, over the last few years?
Well, like all partnerships, you know, they have their ups and downs, and obviously COVID has not been great for having easy partnerships, and neither will the cost of living crisis that we're in, because it will impact on the discussions we have to have about what we do with rents and you know, how universities can support their students. And there's no way of getting around that. And I think in our model in particular, it's a 50-year model, we just have to continue doing it, and we just have to continue trying to help universities to grow, but also help them with their student experience, which we had to do a lot of online student experience over COVID. But I think the cost of living thing is going to be incredibly difficult. I'm sure we're going to come on to talk about rents in a moment. I can't see we get around that one, can we?
I think we've done that, haven't we? It's a difficult one, isn't it? And I spoke to Martin just briefly before he came in, and you've got an RPI increase and utility costs. Looking at your rents for academic year 23-24, it's not inconceivable that you could be pushing up rents by 15%. I think that's probably not unfair or unrealistic. And you know, how on earth do you manage that pass through? You might be able to do it contractually. There might be a cap on your increases, but it's certainly something to something that needs to be, or will be being thought about a hell of a lot over the next few weeks.
Yeah, I think certainly in the later deals that we've done, there was a cap and collar on rent increases. So the simple answer is we're not going to be able to pass those through. The obviously rents are set in discussions with our partners, so we both have to land on what we're going to do. But also we have to take a 50-year view on this. You know, it's a 50-year partnership. It has to work for everybody, and the test will be at the end date. So, you know, we're going to have to take a hit, I'm afraid.
Yeah, and it's whether or not, it's interesting actually, because some of those early deals that Mark or Paula was involved in, and Mark was involved in, and John and I were involved in, it's whether or not you'd ever see them in a similar sense that you would know, whether or not those transactions would move forward. I suppose they've worked exceptionally well for the first 15, 20 years, which goes back to Mark's point. He's still very optimistic about the business model.
Well, I think in terms of, as you would expect, if they're early deals, if they've been done in the early 2000s, these days they're off market in terms of their contractual position. However, the later ones there was sort of, there were more restrictions on what we can do, but that's what we still have to have that negotiation with the university.
Yeah. Paula, in terms of your engagement with universities from what you're doing, I mean, I know in the past there's been significant discussions and dialogue between architects and universities, estates team, etc. in these builds.
Yes.
Is that always been a positive? Has it continued to always be positive?
Oh no, I think it's always a positive to have discussions and feedback. I mean, you might not like what you hear, but it's always positive to have the discussion. And what we don't honestly get enough of is actual feedback from students. So we do get it with our partnering, the people that we work with, and it is sort of fed through. But things get filtered, and direct feedback from students and end users is always really good. I have to say that in the recent stuff we're doing, that's built into the university's process, more so than PBSA process. Into the university process, they will ask for actual feedback from students and workshops and things like that, and that's great. I mean, and then you've got this huge balancing act to do, because everyone wants everything and you can't manage it. So but it's the same the world over. Yeah.
First generation accommodation. So a lot of stock across the country, and if David Feeney were here, he'd no doubt give me the exact percentage of rooms across the sector which are first generation. But it seems to me that a lot of the challenges are going to be about how do you finance the refurbishment of these some of these accommodation blocks that you can't refinance, so they might be in a bond or the like. So I mean that's an interesting one, certainly from Paula's perspective and Maria's perspective operationally. It's great. We're sat in a wonderful build here, but if this was 10, 15
years from now, you might be wanting something different. Yeah. And if someone could come up with a way of making that model work to do that, they'd be onto a winner. Because at the moment we haven't found out. I don't know that anyone knows how to do it.
Well, I think that's probably a wider discussion with the audience, and somebody might have an answer to it. But I'm still not convinced that there is or I've not heard of other than refinancing, whether or not there's a particular way to finance some huge redevelopments and refurbishments that you're looking at. Some of this old first generation stock is still traditional wings and corridors accommodation. You don't have enough communal space. You can see the effect of well-being or the well-being and mental health issues in some of this accommodation. So how do you look forward? And it's certainly something for Wilmore Isles to be, I know you're cognizant of it in smaller developments, but for the bigger developments.
Definitely. But these things don't work without the financial model being in place and the operational model being in place. So if you haven't got the capital costs and the OPEX costs, it's not going to happen. So, blimey, that's noisy.
And did you design this, Paula?
No,
Wonderful.
I can safely say I didn't design this.
Well, we are the graveyard shift, so along with John's tie and the rain, we're pretty scuppered here. I think because I can't read that because is that 5 minutes left? Is that 5? 5? So questions, please, if anybody's got any. Would be great if you can hear us. Brilliant. Are we walking outside to the pub, Kellyanne? Or?
It's pretty incredible, actually. Who needed to hear you guys anyway?
Thanks. Yeah, is there any questions? I'm looking at people that I know, which is really uncomfortable. He's got nothing. He's got nothing. Mark.
Just before we take questions from the floor, I was just going to add to the point that was just been made, that this is not particular just to PBSA about stock becoming obsolete over time. Of course, we see the same in all walks of buildings, and if you think of offices and the way they've moved in recent times, we're just going to have to embrace it in a similar way.
Thanks, Mark. Fighting a losing battle here. So I'm going to try, there's no questions because we can't hear them anyway, so it doesn't matter. So we're going to, I'm going to ask each of the panelists, if I may. So how long have you been in this sector, Maria? 12 years. Okay. So I'm going to go to each of you so you're prepared. Maria is less prepared because I'm asking her here. Move yourself back 12 years ago. What would you have done 12 years ago that perhaps you could pass on to the next generation of student accommodation operators? Is there some nugget of information that you thought, actually, what I really should have focused on was this well-being piece, or what's come to the fore over the last number of years? I was waiting for lots of questions, so I'm on the hop here.
Yeah. Didn't prep us for that one, Sam. I think for me, it would be the university relationship piece, actually. That 12 years ago, if I could speak to myself 12 years ago, I probably would have pushed that a little bit harder. So it's like what I said earlier, right? There was a huge amount of interest between PBSAs and universities when it came to commercial agreements or referral agreements, because there was either a financial kickback there or, the students were benefiting from guaranteed accommodation. I would probably pass on the need for those data sharing agreements and those relationships to be in place from the get-go. And I know London Planning is making sure that's now, kind of happening. Data sharing is something that is very much like a current theme of conversation. But I think I would probably make sure that as these assets are being built and as we start to fill them up, that data is being used in a transparent way so that universities and PBSAs don't have so much of a divide. The universities know who's living in which building, so what percentage of who is where, because I think that's hugely important. And more things like this go on, or, we had a roundtable breakfast discussion this morning. It's key that we listen to the people that are working on site and the people that are speaking to the students, and then feed that back to the universities so they can also transpire that into their student experience packages, because actually that's about welfare 100% the foremost, but it's also a leasing tool, and it's also something that the universities try and improve on year over year. And it's going to take both sides of the coin to work together consistently and for a long period of time to make that happen. So that's what I would tell myself.
Brilliant. Great gap filling as well. That was fantastic. So we've now got, is that 1 minute?
You've got a minute.
2 seconds.
1 minute.
No questions still. Mr. Wakeford, you've got 20 seconds. What would you do differently? What would you say your old self, not your younger self?
Probably work for Mark, who is far more profitable. That's probably what I would have done.
Never employ him, would you, Mark?
I think we could have taken more time to land the demand risk academic and refurbishment piece, because that's where the university's concerns are at the moment. You've got that estate, it's 27 million square meters of estate. Approximately 20% of it needs to be refurbished, entirely refurbished. The rest of it probably needs to be retrofit for environmental targets. That's what I would have done.
Partnerships to the core, Mr. Wakeford.
Absolutely.
Well done. Mark?
I'm going to take a slightly different angle to this. I was a governor at my children's prep school for 10 years. And if I go back to when I started there, the headmistress of the junior department said to me, Mark, the challenge I've got is that she'd been the headmistress there for about 10, 15 years by then. The challenge I've got that each day I sit in my office and I watch a stream of children going off to see matron. They've all got something going on, whether it's allergies for this, hay fever, asthma, whatever it is. And what we've seen, if you add to that mental health as a general theme, so many people have got so many issues. Now, I don't know what the answer is to this, but we're now trying to grapple with it. If we'd been trying to grapple with it 10, 12 years ago, we'd be a lot better off.
33 seconds that took. You're over time.
Right,
Go.
Really quick. I'm just going to carry on from what Ramiro was saying and say more feedback, actually, more talking to people, on the operational side, more talking to the students, more demanding of our clients that we actually sort of interrogate what they say they're going to do. But actually, Sam, what would you have told yourself 12 years ago? Because I think it's quite important that you answer.
Well, I was thinking of a nice line to end this with, but I'm not that smart. I guess the collaboration piece is critical. I would agree with you. There's some fundamental mistakes in some of those early deals, which were transformational and fantastic, so I'm not taking away from that. But I think some of these longer term deals, we didn't consider, right, what do we do when we need a capital sum at year 15? And none of us had anticipated this phenomenal change in student expectation. And John's absolutely right. I think the partnership piece, but also looking to help the university, the higher education sector, more from a private funding perspective with academic builds and things. Nobody's really got there with that. So my answer took longer than yours, which is ridiculous. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for these 4 stellar panelists. Cheers.
If you'd like to exit to the left. Thank you. Oh, that's my left. I am dyslexic. Add into your list of people with problems. Try celiac, dyslexic, ADHD, and the list goes on. Okay, so really awesome day. A lot of content. I know this room is warm, and we've had a few drums beating, etc. But I really hope you've been able to take away some really interesting and thought-provoking initiatives and changes that could potentially happen. So I also just want to say another huge thank you, and this room, you guys can continue chatting to each other afterwards, but to Techno Gym, Hugo, Glide, who have been, as I said at the beginning, have supported us through every single regional this year and has really helped us to elevate and be able to put on events like this today. And then our silver sponsors, Starres and Yardi as well. So I do have good news. We have a space booked, a private space booked in the Botanist, which is around 7 to 8 minutes walk away. It did just throw it down, so fingers crossed it's going to stay dry now for at least 10 minutes. That's booked from 6, so if you would like to join us, which we would love that, and you'd like to continue having these conversations whilst also having a glass of wine, a much needed glass of wine, then please do as well. I'd just like to remind you that if you're interested in the student wellbeing and living monitor, to please reach out to Scott. I'd also like to thank all of our panelists today and our speakers. You've been incredible. Special thanks to Sam for helping not only moderate but curate these conversations. Special thanks to Scott for the exact same. I can't thank myself, it's a bit weird. But also to Aranima that helped put the programme together and unfortunately couldn't be here today, so she wasn't able to actually make it over. So shout out to you at home as well. And the class team that helped pull off this. There's literally 5 of us in our organisation. We seem to do it every single time and I'm absolutely outstanding. So huge round of applause to everybody that's been involved with creating today. Thank you, and you better be clapping at home as well, because I can see you. No, so, okay, thank you again, and we'll continue the conversations, and we'll see you soon. Goodbye.